Good morning, everybody here in the United States. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone else, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to today's virtual policy forum on foreign fighters and U.S. policy, tracking mobilization hubs to stem the flow. It's a real pleasure today to have Nate Rosenblatt and Naureen Chowdhury Fink with us. Nate is a doctoral candidate in sociology at Infield College, University of Oxford, and an international security program fellow at New America. He has lived, worked, and conducted field research in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Morocco, Kuwait, and the UAE. And we are here to primarily discuss his new study recently published by the Washington Institute. Naureen Chowdhury Fink is the executive director of the Soufan Center and former senior policy advisor on counterterrorism and sanctions at the UK mission to the United Nations. She's also worked with the UN Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, CTED, UN Women, and various think tanks. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today. I look forward to the conversation. We will hear first from Nate and then from Naureen, and then we will open up into Q&A. Those of you who have registered and are with us on Zoom will be able to use the Q&A function. Those of you who are participating via live stream can also submit questions by emailing them to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Nate, Naureen, thank you so much for joining us today. Nate, let's just jump right into it. I will mute myself and turn it over to you to discuss your new study.
Thanks a lot, Matt. And thank you to the Jeanette and Eli Reinhardt program on counterterrorism and intelligence and the Washington Institute for making this paper possible. It's been a real pleasure to work on it with you all. And thank you, Naureen, coming and joining us and sharing your thoughts on the paper. I'm looking forward to them, as well as your perspective as a practitioner in this space for many years. And thank you all for coming, and Ramadan Kareem for those who are observing. I'm just going to sort of present the big idea of the paper right off the bat, and then sort of try and connect that idea to a discussion more centered around sort of what to do about it from a policy point of view. And to sort of share the big idea, I think I'll first sort of open with a bit of a story. So almost exactly 5 years ago, an ISIS fighter in the ISIS internal security division called a Niyat smuggled his wife and daughter out of Raqqa to escape ISIS and moved to Turkey. And before leaving, he snuck into his boss's office and swiped a USB stick off his boss's desk. And when he left for Turkey, he exchanged that USB stick for promises of immunity from prosecution. And as many of you may know, that USB stick contained registration forms for ISIS foreign fighters. He exchanged that USB stick with several law enforcement and intelligence agencies, but several journalists also got a copy, and I was given this copy from a friend who's a Syrian journalist. And these files, when I looked at them, were incredibly disorganized. There were thousands and thousands of them. Many were duplicates. They were all over the place. So I spent quite a bit of the summer of 2016 sort of deduplicating and organizing these files, and I found that there were about 3,500 of them. There were registration forms of ISIS foreign fighters who had joined ISIS via the Turkish-Syrian border in 2013, 2014. There are some caveats to these data, which I'm happy to get into. This is something that doctoral students have to do all the time, which is continue to caveat what data they have and what it can and can't say. So happy to discuss that if you want, but for the purposes of this, basically, I think that there are some generalizability to these data, and they're the largest cache of semi-public material on terrorism registration data available. There are about 2,100 of these foreign fighters who came from countries in the Arabic-speaking parts of the Middle East. And so this study sort of focuses on those. And in 2016, what I did was I sort of located those fighters based on their geographic sort of origins. I mean, the fighters in the report, the Washington Institute published, you'll see in the annex sort of what that forum looked like and what questions it asked. But basically, one of the questions it asked fighters was to tell where they came from, not just sort of the countries they came from, but over 90% of the fighters asked said somewhere within the countries of origin, sort of where they were coming from. And so I coded that answer to the largest subnational regions of countries. So it wasn't just that fighters were coming from Libya and Tunisia and Saudi Arabia, but we learned from those forms that fighters were coming from specific geographic regions within those countries. So, Derna and Benghazi in eastern Libya, Qasim and Ha'il in central Saudi Arabia, northern Morocco, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, etc. And that sort of kicked off this whole research, which was, what is it about these particular areas that make them places where we see centralization of recruits? And basically, over the last 5 years, I've been thinking about that question. Why is it that certain places were sort of hubs of recruitment, we call them, let's say call them hubs of recruitment, and not others? And so that's kind of the big idea of the paper. And I'm going to sort of tease it out in a variety of ways, but that is basically that foreign fighters are not sort of dispersed across their countries of origin randomly. They're centralized in certain towns and neighborhoods of cities in places that are called hubs. And these hubs sort of function the way we would imagine any business to function on an economy of scale. The larger they get, the cheaper it is to produce any particular additional goods. So in the case of recruitment, the larger the hub got, the easier it was to sort of recruit each additional new member. The paper provides a sort of statistical definition of where these hubs are, but I should note that they're also clearly observable among the residents who live in them. The recruitment is happening out in the open. It sort of jumps one friend network and becomes a wider social phenomenon in the neighborhood. So one place where they interviewed several hundred young people on the suburbs of Tunis, 81% of those young people said they knew someone who had gone to fight in Syria. This is the kind of dynamic that's happening in a hub. It's commonly known and clearly observed. And so if you use a certain statistical definition of a hub, as I talk about in the paper, what you end up finding is in the Middle East, about 75% of the fighters who joined ISIS from the Middle East joined from hubs. And these hubs comprise together about 11% of the region's population. So you sort of have this Pareto principle at work in which 80% of the consequences come from 20% of the causes. A small number of places generate the disproportionate number of recruits. And sort of that's the sort of key idea here, is that we're seeing these hubs of recruitment emerging for ISIS in places like Derna, Tunis, Muharraq in Bahrain, Qasim, Saudi Arabia. And they worked for a variety of reasons, both from the perspective of the recruiters and from the perspective of the joiners. From the perspective of the recruiters, it was easy to recruit new joiners in this neighborhood because often in places that are hubs, it's a broader social phenomenon in which a group that's almost controls the neighborhood the way we would see an organized criminal group do it. And so these recruiters had access to wider levers of information. So if they wanted to approach someone to join them, you could, as many people who I interviewed, talked about, recruiters would make a case study of individuals before ever really approaching them. And they knew not just more about these potential recruits, but also when to approach them as well. And so by the end, a lot of places, recruiters were no longer having to go out and find new joiners. They were actually filtering people because there was such a high demand to participate. And then from the perspective of potential joiners, the logic of participation expanded. It wasn't just individuals within a certain friend network or who were motivated for political, personal reasons. You might join this group because it was financially attractive for you to do so. They would perhaps give you money for a dowry for you to get married, or help you put a down payment on a business or a house. It was also, for a lot of people for whom many of their friends were joining, it was actually more extreme of position for them to not join than it was for them to join. And in some places, like in the suburbs of Tunis and in Derna, for example, where these groups controlled public safety, it was actually sometimes safer for you to be part of the group than for you to not be part of the group. And so the number of reasons for joining expand in a place like this, but also the number of opportunities for joining expand. So in the paper, I profile a fighter from Saudi Arabia who talked about being approached many times over many years before finally joining. And so hubs work because, like I said, the logic of participation expands there. And so that means that the marginal likelihood of each additional joiner increases in a place that's a hub. So if all things being equal, you're more likely to join if the place is a hub where there are many others joining than not. And so what I learned when I looked at the profile of ISIS fighters who came from places that I categorized as hubs, as opposed to those that were not, is that the profile of fighters who joined in hubs was different from that of those who had joined in places that were not hubs. So if you were an ISIS fighter who joined in a hub, you were more likely to be younger, about on average 3 years younger. You were about half as likely to have had previous experience in conflict. So you were less likely to have fought in the Iraq War or in Somalia or Libya or elsewhere. And you were less likely to have a family. You were less likely to be married. You were less likely to have some advanced professional status, like a professional degree or work in government or in the private sector, etc. And so what that told me was that hubs weren't just the engine of recruitment for ISIS. They were actually the gateway for new fighters to participate in transnational jihadism who might not have otherwise joined. And I think that's why I sort of conclude when we think about this big idea of hubs is that from a research standpoint, it's almost just as important to understand how people are recruited into these movements as it is to understand why they're recruited into these movements. And when we think about how important hubs were in mediating the likelihood of your joining and the profile of the types of people joining, I think we should think very cautiously about taking a large number of people and making a generalization about their, motivations for joining without necessarily considering, the mechanisms of how they were brought into the movement to begin with. And then from a policy standpoint, and this is where I want to sort of transition the conversation to talk a little bit more about the policy implications of this big idea that fighters are recruited in hubs and that these hubs sort of shape their process of joining. From a policy standpoint, I think we need to think a lot more carefully about how we tailor our policy interventions to account for the fact that a small number of places are really the engines of recruitment that these groups rely on to attract a large number of the people who join. And so, I think from a policy standpoint, just to transition, I think we sort of all recognize that the ISIS foreign fighter mobilization was perhaps one of the largest, if not the largest, sort of single effort to recruit foreign fighters in the recorded history of conflict. Even though it was so large, it wasn't necessarily ahistorical. And so the paper talks a bit about the sort of ebbs and flows of transnational jihadism for the last 40 years. Scholars who've looked at this in more depth than me would sort of argue that this is in the Syrian civil war and its spillover into Iraq, constituted the fourth of four waves of sort of foreign fighters who've mobilized, sort of in the name of Salafi jihadism or transnational jihadism, depending on how you describe it. At the moment, and so I think the reason why I talk about the sort of ebbs and flows of foreign fighters is because at the moment I think we're at an ebb. But that doesn't mean that the problem of foreign fighters has gone away. And I think part of the reason why I wanted to write the paper to begin with is to sort of sound the alarm here that we should not be complacent about the issues that foreign fighters pose simply because it's no longer a sort of red alarm issue today. I think Dave Mallet wrote a good paper on the sort of historical comparisons of transnational jihadism to other movements that have sort of precipitated foreign fighters to go to other countries' civil wars. So, socialism or communism is another good example that he's compared it to. And Dave Mallet concluded that transnational jihadism is distinct not necessarily for its size, but for its persistence. People keep migrating from conflict to conflict. Mainly, he attributes that to the fact that governments in the Middle East are unwilling to repatriate, prosecute, and reintegrate their citizens. And Mallet wrote that paper in 2015, and I think looking back on that, I would even edit that to say that transnational jihadism isn't just distinct for its persistence; it's also distinct now for its size, and all the structural conditions that precipitated their emergence in the 2010s in the Middle East are the same or worse. And Liz Sly wrote a great piece on this, sort of looking back on the past 10 years of the Arab Spring, since the Arab Spring protests. Yeah, and we look across the region, we're seeing higher rates of youth unemployment than anywhere else in the world. The region has gotten poorer in absolute and relative terms. We're seeing a tightening of authoritarian rule and a semi-mobilized population among very weak states. So I think the point is to say that we really can't do a good job of predicting the opportunities that foreign fighters might take advantage of to mobilize to conflicts, but we do need to make a greater investment now in understanding and sort of reducing the effects of these structural considerations on their ability to mobilize. And Matt, I know that's something you've talked about in your paper on sustainable counterterrorism. It's how do we make the case that sort of a dollar today saves $100 a year from now when the real emergencies arise. So I want to sort of conclude with that, which is to say that foreign fighters aren't just something we should care about because these fighters might go home and threaten U.S. national security or the security interests of our allies and partners. Foreign fighters exacerbate and extend conflicts when they go to fight in other countries' wars, and they perpetuate a disproportionate amount of harm against civilians in those conflicts too. So we have a huge vested interest in sort of thinking about how foreign fighters are part of a complex space of sort of conflict and sort of transnational terrorist threats. And so I think as a result, we have a vested interest in putting that dollar forward today and thinking about how we put that dollar forward today to prevent $100 from being spent, in the years ahead when the crisis comes up. Thank you.
Great. Naureen.
Well, thanks very much, Winap and Matt and Nate for inviting me here. And this is really a fascinating discussion. Nate, I'm really glad you flagged, many of these issues. I think foremost, the fact that FTFs exacerbate and prolong conflict. And that is something we often talk too little about. We talk about the impact on US national security and on our interests, but we don't talk enough about the impact on civilians and on conflicts in the region. And I think another really important point you flag is that this current ebb in the outflow of FTFs is the time to talk about prevention. It is the time to talk about investment in learning. And I think too often, as we all know, our policy responses are a little reliant on short-term assessments of risk and opportunity. And, it's taken tremendous blood and treasure to counter terrorism in the past 2 decades, whether in Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. And we really risk not learning and then having to expend even more in the future, as you say, a dollar spent and then $100 later. I have a couple of points I wanted to flag, drawing on things that you've already raised in the paper and some of the broader discussions on FTFs in the last decade or so. So there's sort of 5 key points I wanted to touch on, and I know we'll have a discussion after. The first point I wanted to flag is the idea of the social dilemma, and not the Facebook documentary. I already know I spend too much time online. This is true, but the social dilemma is something we don't talk enough about. The social networks of radicalization and mobilization. I think sometimes we focus very heavily on ideology, and I think the hubs and the points you highlight really stress the important role of community, of collective grievance, and the roles of friends and family in mobilizing FTFs. As you note, some of the grievances that have been highlighted can be addressed, through different kinds of action. We might see people turn to unrest and uprising, to emigration or traveling, to join a group like ISIS. And so, yes, while it might be the ideology of an ISIS and the formation of a group like that unlocks that, FTF mobilization, we often spend, too little time thinking about the social networks and the social environment. And so I think that social dynamic of the hub is something really important that you flag. The second point I wanted to touch on was a comparison with FTFs from the West a little bit. I know you focused on the region that is nearest to the Caliphate's core, where there were, of course, the majority of FTFs coming in from, but there was, of course, also an unprecedented number of FTFs from the West. I think it was nearly 4,000 and an estimated 600-700 from the UK alone. I think it would be interesting and possible to see some application of the idea of hubs in the Western space. And I think that particularly interesting was that those who have also experienced similar real or perceived grievances felt marginalized. And as you point out, on the periphery of success, but never really able to access it. And I think that we've seen, similar dynamics in the West. But what I also think some of the stories of FTFs coming out from the West highlight is a sense of vicarious grievance. The hubs you talk about, many of these grievances are real and present. For a number of people we saw traveling from the West, it was that vicarious experience of those same grievances in the hubs that mobilized them. And, in some cases, the impetus to address those grievances was such a strong mobilizer. We saw that, in some of of the first waves of those traveling from the West, it was this kind of humanitarian instinct, the sake of providing humanitarian support to those fighting Assad, a sense that their kind of vicarious or imagined or real community was experiencing those grievances. So I think that's really important because we tend to discount some of these drivers when we look at conditions in the West, but the fact that people feel affinity to communities under pressure, we've seen that in foreign fighter mobilizations in other contexts too, but I think that was really important that these grievances are felt beyond the boundaries of the hub. The third point I wanted to flag and talk a little bit about was the gender dimension. I know it wasn't, a focus of your paper, but I thought that it was, really important that by many estimates, we've seen about 20% of FTFs were women and girls. We know that within this was a wide range of motivations and circumstances, some were compelled, some were coerced, some confused, and of course, some very deliberate and intentional in their choices. Moreover, we know that women played multiple roles. I find it's a pet peeve of mine. It's really too common to hear about the role of women without really adding that S. And I think it's important because we know they were victims, perpetrators, ideologues, enablers, and also that their presence helped, sanitize and legitimate an ISIS narrative of building a state, which also served as a further incentive to FTFs, right? If you don't like the conditions in your hub, in your state, there's this fresh new state developing with women, children, and so it really cleaned up that ISIS narrative. But what I also thought was very interesting about female mobilization is, of course, they had many of the same reasons for going that the men did. And many of the drivers of female mobilization, while their experience of the conditions may have been different because of gender, the rationale for going was quite often the same. And I think that was really important. So I'll turn very quickly to the idea of, so what and what solutions? What does that mean for policy responses? And I fully agree that we need to address the underlying conditions that made hubs such a toxic environment. But also not all of the responses that we undertake to address them will be for the sake of preventing terrorism. We should be working with partners to address many of these conditions, but those partnerships might be through development and other forms of assistance. If, however, it is intended to target hubs specifically from a CT lens, then we will need to think about where to target those efforts. And that's where the issue of hubs comes in, right? If we have limited resources from a CT perspective, where do we want to target prevention measures? I did want to flag in that conversation the UK experience with Prevent. There has been this complex balancing act. If you go too broad, you're missing the key hubs and you're kind of tarring everyone from the same faith or same belief system as a problem. And then that's an issue. But if you're targeting specific hubs with development assistance or integration measures, but you're doing it from a CT lens, then you're further stigmatizing and marginalizing communities. So, having worked on this issue for many years, I wanted to flag that complex balancing act. And I think there's some really important lessons learned from programs like Prevent. And I think one of the key ones is that ensuring the role of local actors and CSOs in designing these initiatives and building trust is key. So it's kind of like investing in smart CVE or PVE. To me, that was one key takeaway from all of this. The second key takeaway for me in terms of solutions was that we need to complement bilateral with international action. Perhaps obvious given my experience and work, but I think given the scale of engagement required to accelerate development and improve the security delivery and address some of those grievances you've talked about, including that big picture of resolving the conflicts that mobilize foreign fighters, we need to complement bilateral action with international cooperation. It's tempting for an administration to think we can do it all alone, but there are many ways we'll need to work with other states, the UN, intergovernmental bodies like FATF and GCTF. And I just wanted to flag very quickly 5 ways that we could do that and where we will need it. One is in the space of legal cooperation. to make sure that there's consistency in the legal approach, and also that counterterrorism isn't then abused to suppress dissent and opposition. So there are legal checks and balances, there should be, that's how the UN frameworks are written, on the use of counterterrorism while making sure you respect human rights. Countering the financing of terrorism is another important aspect. You talked about money, you talked about recruiters, tackling the financial flows that deny terrorist groups these kinds of operational expenses, we know will be key. Another thing, bodies like the UN are tremendously invested in capacity building. And one of the key takeaways for me from the grievances and hubs you discuss, but also from other research, is that we can do more capacity building for human rights and gender sensitive delivery of security. That is a really important, concrete, immediate thing we could do. Another quick one is strengthening civil society partners, not only because they're important interlocutors in delivering assistance, but they're important in maybe providing a credible pathway for action, right? If you're frustrated, if you have grievances, we need to provide some credible pathways for people to act, whether it is challenging, government, providing humanitarian assistance. I think the important role of creating viable alternatives for civic action is really important. And from a security perspective, we will need international cooperation in tracking the movement of known terrorists and making sure that there are means of ensuring that terrorists are not able to take advantage of refugee flows and movements of persons, and at the same time, ensuring that movements of persons and refugee flows are not compromised by counterterrorism. I'm going to leave it at that, but thanks so much for inviting me to join this conversation. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Naureen. Matt, can I jump in and respond to a couple of those points? Because Naureen raised a lot of great points that I've been feverishly taking notes down. I'd love to respond to.
So why don't you do a real quick response? Then I want to take my moderator's prerogative to ask a question. And I want to make sure we get to the questions because we got a lot of interest. Two phenomenal presentations. But let's start, Nate, with some response to Naureen's points, and we'll jump right into it.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. I was really excited to have the chance to chat with Naureen about this, and you raised so many great points, Naureen. I just felt like I wanted to keep that conversation going. So really quick, 3 things. You talk about the sort of social network dimension of it, and I think it's super important. Someone always brings you in. You're always sort of brought in by a person into this movement, and that's been my experience in integrating friends and family of joiners as well as returnees. But on the one hand, obviously that is a huge problem in terms of thinking about how people get recruited, but it's also the potential solution too, because at the same time as someone always brings someone into the movement, someone always knows, a friend or family member always knows that this person that they care about is at risk of being recruited or is already recruited. And that doesn't just involve, matter for foreign fighters. I think we also see that constantly when we talk about sort of gun violence in the United States. Mothers are telling the police to take the guns away from their kids, or a girlfriend flags to someone that, this guy she dated is a threat for a mass casualty incident. Someone always knows. The question, as you said at the end of your remarks, is to empower communities to find help when they're asking for it. And I think we often really do a pretty substandard job of providing that assistance, even in sort of Western democracies. And, that's much more complicated when it comes to some of the more authoritarian governments in the Middle East. And we could talk more about that later if you like. On the gender component, I completely agree. I wish that I had a chance to sort of tease that out more, and especially with the sort of fall of the caliphate, I think scholars who've looked at the roles of women in some of these movements have found that these roles become even more important in keeping these groups alive when they're on the back foot. Elizabeth Parkinson's done some great work on the role of women in the PLO during the Lebanese Civil War. So I think we need to be paying even more attention to that. I think one place where I think the microscope should be obviously focused on is the role of women in propagating ISIS beliefs in the Al-Hol camp and some of the detention displacement camps in Northeast Syria and Iraq. And then finally, I would just say, there's such an important point you made about how do you balance between working with communities and making communities feel stigmatized by the attention. And there's so much we could talk about there, but I think it's really important that I don't want people to take away from this paper that, there are hubs of recruitment in certain neighborhoods and certain towns that we should be then sort of blaming these neighborhoods. It's more that I think we should be engaging with these neighborhoods in a conversation on how to protect themselves from these groups, because at first, sometimes these groups provide real benefits in communities where there aren't, proper government services to resolve disputes or protect residents from crime and predation. But over time, I think what they end up coming to learn is that the costs are greater than the benefits on net. And so I think making that case in a more engaged and interactive way, rather than simply retroactively blaming communities for allowing this kind of thing to propagate within their members, is a much more effective way to do that. I'm cognizant, Matt, that you have a question, and always your questions are great. So I want to stop there, but thank you so much, Naureen, for those interventions.
I have to make sure my question is worthy. First of all, I want to remind anybody who's watching via live stream that you are welcome to submit questions via the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. We have a few questions already. To kick it off, I'd like to pose a couple, one to Nate and one to Naureen. Nate, one part of your study takes things one step further and suggests how we might be able to identify where the next hubs might be. So once we convince policymakers that the ebb is the perfect time, the exact time to be thinking ahead and trying to preempt another foreign fighter crisis, what can we tell them about kind of where to look, generally, specifically? And Naureen, following up in particular on that first point on the social dilemma and the challenges people face, the National Intelligence Council just recently produced its latest Global Trends report, Global Trends 2040. Drink it with alcohol in hand. It's not pleasant reading, suggesting that things are going to get worse for people in lots of places in the world. What types of things, once we've identified where these current or next hubs might be, can I ask you to drill down a little bit? What types of things should we be looking to do with local partners, with local CSOs? So, Nate will kind of tell us where to look and maybe kind of what government should be thinking about their role specifically. And if we can get those governments to partner with locals in places where we know migration, lack of access to food or water, conflict is likely to happen in almost any of the scenarios that Nick laid out, what types of things can we do that, whether they are focused on development or something else, would have a benefit for trying to deal also with the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon? So maybe, Nate, you could start. Where should we look? And then Naureen, what would you have us do?
Thanks a lot, Matt. It's a great question, as always. I think what I learned from studying these hubs is, we can say where and how hubs form. I think it's much more complicated to talk about what hubs form for. So we can talk about, where these sort of central places of recruitment form. And for those who have been observing these hubs in the Middle East, I think we'll recognize a lot of them. There's Dahia in Beirut, Sadr City in Baghdad, certain neighborhoods around Mosul, Bab al-Amr in Homs. I mean, these aren't necessarily neighborhoods that supported foreign fighting, but they all look really similar in that certain groups that relied on a disproportionate number of residents from these neighborhoods, recruited residents from these neighborhoods to carry out acts of violence or to engage in contentious politics like protests, rioting, etc. So it's sort of, there's a tension in the report where we talk about where the next hubs are going to form, because it's almost like paraphrasing Eisenhower, predicting is useless, but the process of prediction is essential. Like, how do we think about where these places are going to form? And I sort of come down on saying, I think where the future hubs are going to form is really important to think about. It doesn't necessarily mean that those are going to be the future hubs of foreign fighting. For example, the places that were hubs for ISIS recruits in Tunis are now hubs of violent protests in Tunisia as a result of COVID-induced lockdowns. So these are places, I guess you could say, where foreign fighting exists as a symptom of a broader set of issues that are motivating residents to make tremendous personal sacrifice, to try and see some kind of change in the way the sort of community has access to basic livelihoods. And so, I think if we think about foreign fighting existing in complex space in which, domestic rebellion could also exist, organized criminal activity could exist, I do see a lot of this kind of contentious political activity occurring on the outskirts of major Middle Eastern cities. These are places that are highly informal. Even the vast majority of people don't have basic things like property rights, even birth certificates. They're often quite isolated socially, politically, and economically. They don't have sort of traditional outlets to advocate for their rights and interests. They don't have, and so that's why we see a lot of these sort of higher likelihood of political violence. People engage in political violence because they don't see any avenue for them to go through legitimate political means to advocate for change. And so I think about the outskirts of cities, not just because they're sort of socially, economically, and politically isolated. I mean, these are the kinds of factors that I think we saw precipitate the rise of foreign fighter recruitment hubs. There are also places that are sort of relatively poor and yet near communities of great wealth. So there's this sense of relative deprivation that's going on there too. And so, if I'm advising the policymakers on thinking about where future hubs might emerge and sort of the issues related to them, I'm thinking about these sort of urban outskirts, the sort of urban periphery. These cities are growing faster than they can accommodate the population. I'm thinking about helping these cities in the short run provide better social work in these communities to help residents integrate into city life and find work in the formal sector. Often people are doing everything informally, not just sort of informally finding ways to resolve disputes, but also informally finding work in gray and black markets. And these are the places where terrorist groups and other organizations sort of take advantage of citizens and civilians to recruit. So I would be, in the short run, working with communities to help these families that are moving into these cities integrate more fully into the life of the city. And then in the long term, I'm talking about, I think we need to be thinking more about investments in developing these communities to being bigger parts of society. So we're talking about basic things like infrastructure investments in recreational and cultural facilities, et cetera. And I think these are long-term investments and plans, but I think right now groups rely on people from these communities because they have such limited outlets for expressing grievances, for advocating for their interests, and for making a life that's better for their kids than it would be for them. And so even in Tunisia, which has transitioned from an authoritarian dictatorship to a democracy, people in these communities are not seeing the benefit of that change at all. And in fact, it's probably made their life worse. So I think it's trying to encourage governments that are both authoritarian and also that are willing to accommodate demands of citizens to think more about how we integrate these neighborhoods more effectively into the body politic.
Great transition for Naureen.
Yeah, that's a great segue, because I think one of the really important roles for civil society actors is to help communities increase their agency in addressing the grievances. So one of the common threads we've seen from a lot of FTF mobilization and radicalization is that sense of frustration about not being able to do anything about those grievances, right? So I think a really important role for civil society is to allow communities to take more control over addressing those grievances and, of course, actually addressing them. But I think there's another element to that also, is that there needs to be a protection element. We quite often call on local civil society actors to do the job that the state was supposed to do in the first place. And so when we are calling for engagement with civil society, we need to make sure that we've created pathways that also protect them, not that we call them out to engage and then they are sort of unprotected. And I think there are two particular areas that are quite concrete that we need to think about in terms of how we engage with CSOs on counterterrorism. One is work with them to decrease the incidence of human rights violations in communities. We are seeing consistently in many regions, as a great UNDP report about Africa called Journey into Extremism. But many studies have shown that the experience of human rights violations at the hands of the state is a very important driving force. And that even when people experience, hard security measures, if they think it's justified and if there isn't a kind of human rights violation associated with it, they can accept that. But it's the experience of human rights violations that really dissolves trust with the state. So working with CSOs to try and improve that experience between citizen and state, I think is important. On a very concrete legal level, improving their access to finances and support. We've seen inadvertently, in some places maybe by design, but largely inadvertently, a lot of NGOs have not been able to access financing because of de-risking measures and because counterterrorism measures and sanctions have meant, on one hand, yes, we have stopped terrorist groups from accessing finance, but in some cases, the approach from the private sector of de-risking has been so broad that the same CSOs that we are calling on to help us deliver humanitarian assistance, help with communities, those same CSOs are being criminalized and penalized. So we have to be better. I mean, good, effective counterterrorism and really impartial, credible humanitarian assistance is not mutually exclusive. We can rebalance that for CSOs.
So we have a bunch of great questions and comments. Most of the comments are letting me know in various ways our listeners agree with many things you've said. I'll just say thank you to those people. A bunch of questions asked you to explain how human rights is part of this, and I think we just did that very, very well. So the first question I want to go to asks, in my opinion, mobilization and recruitment operations differed significantly after the defeat, the battlefield defeat of the Islamic State, and they transformed from easy movement from one country to another to mobilization across local countries. Do you agree? Has it changed, and in what ways has it changed?
I mean, yes, I agree. I think that's basically, I think the modality of recruitment of foreign fighters in ebb periods of their mobilization when they're at an ebb. And so, yeah, I mean, I think right now what we're seeing is the locus shifting more to Africa, more regional sort of cross-border movements of foreign fighters. But, I don't think that precludes us from still thinking about the importance of foreign fighters mobilizing from many countries to one or two neighboring countries, as we saw in the 2010s with ISIS. I just think we look across the Middle East and see plenty of states that are sort of taking risks to remain secure, not because they're doing it from a position of security. I think they're doing it from a position of perceived extreme insecurity. And we could count on, we could count the number of states where, some kind of coup or, dispute over power could very easily galvanize a very large number of people to focus on a particular country. But in the short term, yes, I agree. It's much more local.
I think underscoring one of the key points of your paper that during the ebb is a critically important time to address the problem. The concern is that countries look, they see that the problem isn't as big as it was. They start thinking that maybe the policies and procedures they put in place have solved it. It's kind of, to my mind, the biometric option. We invested a lot of money in biometrics, trying to make it more difficult for people to travel, but it hasn't addressed the issue of why people were being radicalized and mobilized in specific places in the first place. And it hasn't done anything to prevent that from happening again. Maybe it's made it more difficult for them to travel across distances, but if the distances shrink, maybe the biometric option won't be as effective. Let me ask a question first to Naureen, and then if you want to jump in on this too, feel free. One of our participants asks, if hubs are the focus of recruiting and have long been mapped by security forces, what precludes states from focusing their non-military efforts on these same areas to provide an alternative option? Why do we not see, at least in certain instances, states not stepping up and using non-military options to address a problem if we know it exists? And feel free to jump in on this last question.
Sure. I think the answer is in Nate's paper as well. I mean, many of these hubs have been already ignored or brutalized by their government for a reason. Either it's a ethnic makeup, economic, divergence, class, whatever. But many of these hubs have already been neglected by the state, and the seeds of distrust with the state is already there for many reasons. As we said, ISIS is, a group like ISIS is kind of like the fire that can set it off, the match, but there is already a pre-existing bad relationship with the state. So it's not difficult to see that these are the same areas that the state is not going to invest to address these grievances, because that's the whole reason the grievances are there in the first place. And that's why I was saying, that's where you need a bit of government to government relationship to either encourage or incentivize that investment or highlight the risks. And then, of course, this is something I guess Nate can also comment on, those hubs can shift depending on which group becomes a lightning rod again. I just wanted to flag in response, I think, to your earlier question also, we haven't really talked a lot about the pandemic. I mean, that's a huge game changer in many states. And we don't know, we might end up with a proliferation of so many hubs in the next 2 years that the idea of a hub almost, doesn't matter, because it's like entire swaths. And we might see we will see other groups come in, and that's the long game ISIS plays. It doesn't always have to be about them. Other groups will come in and pick up on post-pandemic or pandemic-driven grievances. But I think one of the key reasons that there isn't investment in non-military solutions is there wasn't that interest or investment in the first place. And that's why we got here. And that's, we're seeing in parts of Northeast Syria and all. I mean, the conditions that gave rise to a lot of the grievances are, as Nate said, already getting worse. So, yeah.
A bunch of people added comments to underscore the idea of hubs, but noting they're not just in the Middle East, and people are commenting on the West and Albania and other places, which I know we both agree with. It's just that your data set may happen to focus on the Middle East, which gets me to a data set question. I know Nate's going to be very happy here when someone kind of just dives into the PhD-ness of it all. Can you talk to what the existence of hub dynamics and factors rooted in local neighborhood effects foretells for the value of large N analysis of terrorism trends?
Yeah, well, now I feel like
explain large N's.
I think what this person is talking about is and thank you for the question, is sort of the value of doing quantitative analysis on terrorism studies when the data are extremely imperfect, often biased in certain ways that are sometimes impossible to sort of control for when doing one of these big 5-digit number regression studies. I think that they play a really important role, but I don't think that they sort of have a monopoly on truth. I do think it's really important to understand sort of what are the conditions more generally that maybe describe where hubs emerge. And I really relied on the quantitative analysis to understand that hubs are generally forming in poorer parts of wealthy areas that have higher rates of unemployment, that are, have actually generally decent services and higher rates of women working in the labor force. These are good ways to sort of tee up questions that I can then answer or ask when doing field work. But I don't think quantitative analysis in this field has a space in which qualitative work of actually going around and talking to people about what the mechanisms are behind all these findings. I don't think that I think the two have to work together, basically. And understanding the mechanisms by speaking to the people for whom this kind of experience is actually part of their daily life or part of their own personal experience, I think is key. I wanted to, Matt, if it's okay with you, I wanted to transition to respond to something that Naureen had said about sort of empowering communities and thinking about how COVID has affected their ability to respond. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Naureen, I think you make it just such a great point about sort of the importance of empowering communities and yet also caveating the fact that they're not a panacea by any means. I think, for example, when I look at how these hubs work when they form, what ends up happening is there's sort of a clear social hierarchy in them, in that you have a small number of people who basically control the levers of power and have a wide-ranging set of skills. They're usually very charismatic. They have connections to people in government. They have connections to supporters who aren't active parts of the movement, but who give them money or provide them the mosque to meet in, or provide even legal services, for example. And they also have connections to the transnational jihadist movement more broadly, and they are able to raise money. So, when you look at, for example, the estimated 3,000 people who went from Tunisia to join ISIS, I sort of did a social network analysis of how they were connected to one another. And what I ended up finding is about 20 people were responsible for the recruitment of the 3,000 of them, right? And so when we think about what we ask communities to do, I think we really need to be careful about thinking about them as a panacea. I think they're able to work on the margins of people who are, at risk of being recruited into these movements, but they're not going to be the ones to, build a case against these 20 people and break the connections those 20 people have to all of the things that empower this movement where it's active. I think what we need to do is work with, in this case, law enforcement and others, to focus not on the cases of the couple of kids who, were reported by their friend as, meeting so-and-so in the mosque, but rather to focus on the people who they were meeting in the mosque and the people that have these connections. And it sounds simple, don't look at the 3,000, Tunisian police, look at the 20. But in fact, in practice, it's really hard, because those are the people who have, the most information. They're able to skirt law enforcement attention. They're able to galvanize a lot of people to protect them. So it's actually really complicated to do that. But I think from the perspective of government policy, you have to support the communities you're trying to empower to provide assistance at the local level with this kind of broader institutional effort.
So we have a nice question that follows onto this. Maybe, Naureen, you can take the first stab. Nate, you gave this kind of classic 80-20, right? Conundrum. 75% of the fighters come from the hubs, which are about 11% of the region's population. One of our participants asks, let's reverse the calculus. People with grievances in certain hubs join. How come, whatever it is, 99%, the majority of the people from the same hub presumably also have grievances, maybe even the same grievances, but they don't join? And I'll add to the kind of why, that I'll ask, what can we learn from why those people in those hub spaces don't join, about what we can do to affect the other that did?
Matt, you've kind of presaged my answer in your question, because I did a few years ago, my God, many years ago now, I wrote a paper precisely on that, looking at particular countries where it looked like, radicalization was on the upswing, but then why hadn't it kind of reached a worse situation than we expected. And that's exactly some of the stuff I was looking at. What were the sources of resilience within certain communities or certain places? And there was a lot of things. And I wrote this paper before we had the lexicon of CVE, and I was essentially arguing, look for the things where the resilience comes from. Is it pride in your national culture? Is it pride in a certain historical event? Is it, democratic engagement, and so that feeling of agency that doesn't then require you to go join a group like ISIS. So I think that question of why people don't join in many of the same hubs will be really particularly interesting. And I come back a little bit to the gender element, because those were a couple of stories I heard from law enforcement in the West. And I just wanted to share that, somewhat related to this answer, is a lot of times people missed who those 20 recruiters were, because they never thought to look for the women. There was a couple of police officers were telling me that they had noticed people traveling and they were not able to isolate who the network hub was, and it's only when that person left with her family that they realized she had been the linchpin, sort of communicating people. And it just comes back to also thinking a little bit with a bit more nuance in terms of where your connectors are and how that relationship is. And to be quite honest, there's a phenomenal amount of research on women and terrorism. This is not new, but I think in terms of really thinking that women had agency and that women might deliberately, put out certain ideology or be active recruiters, that also may have skewed our picture into looking at how recruitment is happening in certain places. So in a way, Matt, you answered your own question, which allowed me to wax lyrical about gender and recruitment.
Wasn't even planned. We are getting toward the end of our time, and we have more questions we'll be able to get to, which is a sign of a fabulous discussion and a really great underlying paper. Thank you both. I'm going to try and package some questions together. We have a few questions that ask us to extrapolate and think ahead. One asks about Afghanistan, where the United States has announced plans to withdraw down to zero forces. And under that circumstance, do you see it likely that hubs will start recruiting candidates for terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan? Nate, Naureen, do you see the lack of US forces being able to provide the necessary security for humanitarian organizations, creating a situation where hubs start developing or new hubs start developing in Afghanistan? Let's start with you, Nate, because Naureen just went.
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, I think it's a good, I think it's a good assessment. I think one of the things that makes it relatively easy to study transnational jihadism is that they're predictably reactive, right? I mean, they move almost osmotically to the places of least resistance. And so, I think in that case, we will certainly see mobilization of foreign fighters to go to Afghanistan. I think for sure. It's hard to sort of predict, however, what conflicts or incidents are going to galvanize people on a larger scale. And I think we're still a way away from any incident doing that in the extent to which, the war in Iraq or the civil war in Syria has in the past 2 decades. It doesn't preclude any event in the future from having that kind of effect in Afghanistan or elsewhere. So I think what we'll see is sort of a modest flow of foreign fighters I'm talking about hundreds, not thousands, going to Afghanistan. But we're still, I think, years away from seeing, that thousands of persons from multiple countries beyond the region scale taking place.
Naureen?
Sorry about that. It was inevitable. It had to happen once in a meeting that I speak when muted. I was going to say, just a reminder that in South and Southeast and Central Asia, just a few hundred foreign fighters did quite a lot of damage post-Afghan, conflict. And that changed the tenor of a lot of this discourse in the region. So it's not just a numbers game. It's the nature of that influence was quite dangerous. My comment on that will be how, I think how conflicts are resolved is a big question about what impact they will then have on foreign fighter mobilization. So how we see the political process play out in Afghanistan will, I think, be a big indicator of the kind of risk that we see. I think very few people in the region think that the Taliban will disavow al-Qaeda having offered them, played host and protector to them before. It would be very difficult. But I think, how that peace process plays out and how that conflict is not only resolved, but perceived as resolved will be a key determinant. And just back to my earlier point, other people will also be watching how we treat our Afghan partners when our troops leave, what kind of protections we offer for the objectives we said were important to us, human rights, treatment of women. It's not just the departure of troops. Our failure to protect our stated priorities will, I think, be a real cause célèbre around foreign fighters in the region and beyond. So I think it will be a key question. Yeah.
Finally, last question. In the past, when conflicts have started to ebb, fighters have gone home. State Department's Intelligence and Research Branch famously wrote a piece called The Wandering Mujahideen, The Boys Are Coming Home, years ago. Several questions asked about the loss of the caliphate, the so-called Islamic State. And do we think that the hubs that exist or the hubs that may come to exist, if there's not a great place to go, either because it's a safe haven or because it's an attractive place to go. Do we think that this might lead to extremism back home in home countries? Either one.
Go ahead, Naureen.
I was kind of hoping Nate would take that first, so I had a moment to think
Okay,
about
sure, yeah,
it.
happy to,
No, no,
happy to.
no, but I'm just happy to come in and say that, yeah, I think, we don't quite know how this will play out. Yes, I think that the lack of repatriation, but also the lack of accountability for Daesh crimes will determine maybe where people can congregate and how countries treat returnees. So I just wanted to flag that, it's not just about whether or not countries repatriate, it's also what happens after. Are there proper reintegration programs? Are there serious accountability mechanisms? Because you can't repatriate somebody and then have them just go scot-free and have, no assessment of what risk they pose and what crimes they perpetrated. So I think how that is handled will certainly affect where and how some of the hubs form. But that was just, yeah.
Nathan, you sparked the soul. You get the last word, my friend.
Okay, it seems fitting. I think we're blowing the opportunity to reintegrate and repatriate these foreign fighters, and I think we're sowing the seeds for future conflict in the region and beyond. Repatriation, I think, is the critical mission of this decade, and I think if we don't pay more attention to putting the diplomatic weight behind making that happen, and then helping countries with the resources to reintegrate the citizens who do return, I think we're setting the seeds for the next conflict. And I think Iraq is sort of a perfect bad example of what's happening right now. I mean, the system sets up sham trials that are 15 minutes long for people with ISIS affiliation and result in death sentences. I mean, and the Iraq system is, I empathize with it, and I've lived in Iraq for 3 years. I empathize with the system is overwhelmed with cases, and so simply doesn't have the resources to deal with them. The problem, though, is that what ends up happening is that in Iraq, the incentives are for all the low-level people to get arrested, while the higher-level people get away scot-free. And because the system is so punitive, what you end up doing is incentivizing vendetta-seeking rather than what you should be doing, which is reconciliation. And so I think Iraq is almost ground zero in thinking about how the failure of our efforts to pay more attention and give more resources to the issue of repatriation, reintegrating foreign fighters is only sowing the seeds, I think, for the next conflict in Iraq and potentially in other countries where this may be a problem as well.
Nate, Naureen, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. This has been a fabulous conversation. As evidenced by the fact that we were not able to get to all the questions. I tried to group them all together. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. I do encourage everyone to take a look at Nate's study, which is available at the Washington Institute's website, WashingtonInstitute.org. Thank you all for participating in this latest virtual policy forum of the Jeanette Eli Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Be safe, be healthy. Thank you all very, very much.